Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Brooke Gladstone. Many people know you as co-host of On the Media, produced at WNYC in New York and heard on other radio stations as well. You're also the managing editor and the author of The Influencing Machine, which is not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a new book of yours called, here it is, The Trouble with Reality, a rumination on moral panic in our time. Now, Brooke, I know what many of our listeners and viewers are saying. They're saying, I don't have time to read a book. Well, I've got some good news for them, Brooke. Your book is very short.
Yes, it is. It's a rumination.
It's a rumination. That's what it says right in the subtitle. If it were an epic, it would call itself an epic. If it were an exhaustive multi-volume analysis, it would say that. But it just says a rumination. And it's a very good one. Now, it has something to do with Donald Trump, I should say.
Yeah.
And this is signaled in the first paragraph. And the first paragraph also has such an ominous tone that I want to read it.
Sure.
To give people a sense for the stakes here. Okay? We're talking about reality itself, after all. Okay, here's the first paragraph. Perhaps you picked up this book because an icy hand grips your viscera, sometimes squeezing, sometimes easing, always present. And you suspect that this intimate violation, this forced entry, proceeds from something more profound than politics. You imagine that reality itself is engaged in an epic existential battle, and you stand helpless against the onslaught, as the truth is trampled into dust. That's trampled into dust, not trampled into dust.
Yeah.
Now, is that a clue? Is that a clue?
It is, and it's a cheap pun.
No, that's not cheap. I'd pay real money for that pun if I hadn't already paid money for the book containing it. So it is a rumination on the age of Trump. And how would you say, for starters, that there have been other ruminations. How would you say that yours differs from others? What's your angle here?
Well, it's pretty personal, but I arrived at this idea when basically a publisher that is working with the program on another book showed up a couple of weeks after the election and said, we really want you to do something on the election. Everyone is so upset. And I said, first of all, if I spend a whole lot of time trying to write a real book, the world could change. And then you spend a year before you get it out, the world could change 10 times over. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to figure out, to the best of my ability, what it is particularly that gets people so upset. Why this is more than just an election that didn't go your way. Why is it more even than a fear for the future of the country? We've had that before too, and not that long ago. So I said I would try and figure out why this high-pitched wail sounded so much more desperate coming out of many precincts of the country, and that's all I would do. And I would take 2 weeks to write this book, didn't leave the house. Basically, I'm inviting the reader down a couple of rabbit holes. It's me wandering around trying to figure out the source of the distress, what it means in the political sense, that's the Trump part, and then ultimately what we're going to have to do to begin to relieve it. But it's more like managing a disease than curing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, this is, a theme kind of running through the book is the question of, like, how different is this, kind of, right? I mean, how weird is this? How different is this from what's come in the recent past in America, what's come ever? And on the one hand, clearly you're saying it's pretty different from most of what most of us are familiar with, that there's a sense in which the construction of reality itself is at stake. On the other hand, you make reference to a number of thinkers who have written about things like this, so it must not be completely unprecedented in all its dimensions, right?
Not in all its dimensions. There are a couple of dimensions. The most salient of which is probably the internet, because, you know, I have to discuss, basically my thesis is that we all live in these realities that we have to construct, that, we create our own truths with a lot of different parts. We use facts, and we use and the things that we see, and then we use a lot of the things we don't actually see, like principles and beliefs and traditions, and then we just sort of marinate them into a stew, and then we create our own bespoke bubble, so to speak. And we have to, because the world is too complicated to understand in its entirety. We have to use shortcuts, stereotypes, the academics like to call it heuristics. We need ways, tricks of being able to comprehend the world in a way that is consistent with our understanding of how the world works. And then we proceed comfortably, and nothing is more upsetting than fucking with your universe. That is incredibly upsetting.
I hate it when people do that.
And basically, if you imagine that we're all, you want to think of us as maybe going down a highway, or if that's a cliche, you can think of us as being in that sort of bingo rolling thing, and all of us are just rolling around in there, and then at some point there's this big crash and all the balls are splatted, or a few of them are, and they're just a bunch of shards, and you have to figure out how to stick your reality back together so that you can function. But you need to do it along more durable lines, or it's just going to happen again.
Okay. So in mentioning the internet, you buy, to some extent, the conventional argument that one thing that's happened is the so-called fragmentation of the media landscape. We can build these little cocoons for ourselves. Because, a big part of the book is, or an important part, is this idea that the very notion of a shared reality is suddenly in question, and presumably that means there was a time when there was such thing as a shared reality. And of course, some people would say, well, that was just because there were only 3 TV networks, right? And that's the big difference, and the internet is at the opposite extreme from that, right? But,
right.
So you're attributing some validity to that argument. But you don't spend a lot of time on it, and it seems like you think a lot more is going on.
Yeah, I do. And you read The Influencing Machine. In fact, you're at the end of The Influencing Machine. You are my concluding note, and you look wonderful.
I look marvelous. I looked marvelous in your first book, I've got to say.
It's a comic book for anybody,
well,
for everybody.
You didn't have to tell them that, but anyway, I looked marvelous. Yeah.
But anyway, I argued in that book that the internet creates problems that the internet has the power to solve. We're still waiting for the second part of that, but I still think it can happen. But certainly we have seen an erosion of the public square. There's this thing that computer geeks love to talk about, which is serendipity, encounters with accidental information that you'd never seek out. Back in the day when most people, if they read the paper, they read it in paper. You might see an article on Gambia, and maybe you were never interested in Gambia, but it had an interesting headline, it had a good lead, and then you found yourself reading past the jump, and then maybe for a while you stayed a little bit interested in Gambia. That kind of thing's happening less and less. So we are able to tailor our worlds so that if all we're interested in is gardening and volleyball, that's pretty much what we get. Now, I do not blame this on the internet, which is why I don't spend a huge amount of time on it. I blame it absolutely on human nature. And my feeling is that the internet makes us just more of what we were going to be anyway. And there are some studies that suggest this, that if you're a very curious person, you get to indulge that curiosity and go places that you might not ever had been able to go, but now you can because of the internet. And if you're an incurious person, you can blot out a lot of the world and still delude yourself into thinking that you actually live in it, which none of us actually does.
Okay. So I mentioned that there are several kind of thinkers you pay a lot of attention to who have grappled in the past with something that's at least relevant to this. Let's start with maybe one of the less obvious ones. I mean, the one you might not have thought of, Walter Lippmann.
Right. That book is unbelievably prescient on public opinion, which he wrote in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And, so much of what he observed is still the case and still bound to be the case. And all the problems with democracy that he identifies are still the very same problems. And he didn't have any internet. So, there you go. It's human nature. What do people care about? What are they drawn to? What does that mean for our constitutionally endorsed free press, which is supposed to enable us to make good decisions and all of that? It means that you have created something that you regard as a public institution with an important civic mission, but you give it no public funds or support. So it has to survive as an attractive good that people will want to buy on their own, and people feel that they have a right to information for free. Mm-hmm. They don't feel that way about entertainment. And so, as I observed in the book, entertainment has become and has always been the tail that kind of wags the news dog. And if you don't like the news that you're getting, especially now, maybe you ought to cough up a few bucks and pay for it.
Okay, so that kind of brings us to this this contrast you draw between, that someone had drawn, and you draw on the drawing of the contrast between Orwell and
Postman. Yeah,
between Orwell and Huxley. So we've heard a lot about this being an Orwellian age, mm-hmm. And Trump being an Orwellian figure, and so on. But there was another dystopian book published, I guess, I don't know how long, I guess after later. 1984, but Huxley's Brave New World.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, he got it more right than Orwell, I guess.
Yeah. Do you want me to read a little bit of the Postman part?
Sure.
Neil Postman wrote this book in 1985 called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he is worrying a lot about stuff that he was sure was going to happen, that was going to debase our intellects and so on. He is a brilliant guy. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but this I always thought was incredible. And basically he said was that Orwell, the author of 1984, feared those who would ban books, whereas Huxley, the author of Brave New World, feared that there would be no reason to ban a book because there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much information that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared that we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. In 1984, Orwell added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us.
And so, just to draw that out a little, first of all, Orwell was assuming that the great peril would be the centralized control of information.
Yeah, he was watching Soviet ascendancy. He was seeing the end of the Nazis. And he also saw with the Soviets a lot of the stuff he drew from for 1984 about messing with people's reality, redrawing it in front of them and asking them not to believe their own experience or the evidence of their own eyes. We're seeing some of that now, which is something that Hannah Arendt, who has been quoted a lot in this Trumpian period, because she was so good on anatomizing the techniques that were being used during the fascist and communist rises.
Right. And it's true. I mean, there is arguably some Orwell in Trump in the sense that he seems to say things that are flagrantly at odds with the truth and get people to believe him. But the big difference, I guess, is in 1984, the Big Brother did this kind of by force, imposed the illusion on pretty much everyone by virtue of the strength of this centralized technology and whatever else. But in the current situation, it's just people who are disposed to want to buy into Trump's reality who buy into it, and the rest react against it. And the ones who buy into, well, both sides, you could argue, are doing what Huxley worried about, which is just following them where their emotions lead them, in a certain sense. Believing what it feels good to believe.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out that what matters to people is how consistent their reality is. So they will embrace information, true or otherwise, that keeps that reality whole, that is consistent with that reality, and they will reject information, especially if they're repeatedly invited to, if it threatens the integrity of that reality. I also quote William James in the book, who talks, the great pragmatist, who talks a lot about how we, when forced to integrate some information that exists in contradiction with our way of seeing the world, and we have to accept it for one reason or another, because if we don't, we won't get what we want, or if we don't, it'll put some other of our ideas in peril, or so on and so forth. So what you do is you take this idea, you incorporate it into your worldview, but only by changing your worldview as little as you possibly can. You do just the smallest amount of adjustment in order to incorporate this rather undesirable piece of info, and then you create, and then you work around it.
Right.
Throw your reality back around it, kind of like, a lesion.
Right. James was so far ahead of his time in so many ways. I mean, that's a little related to the later idea of cognitive dissonance, but the same idea that we work to minimize internal conflicts within our belief system, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do in its own right. But as James said, we only do it if forced. I mean, we only integrate contradictory information if forced. And there's a lot, I mean, a big theme in the book is, in a certain sense, that human beings are irrational, right? Or they don't care. Like, Henry Frankfurt, or is it Harry Frankfurt, on Bullshit? Mm-hmm. And, he talks about liars are people who want to deceive you. Bullshitters don't care if they deceive you or not. They're just using information. They don't know if it's true or not, or if they do, they don't really care. They just want to do something for the moment. And I think for most of us, it's quite similar. We just want to do, we want to get by for the moment. Mm-hmm. And this is a moment when none of us could get, many of us, more than half the country, couldn't get by. Did I just lose you or myself? I think I lost myself. You mean you lost yourself?
I think I was about to answer your question.
No, it made sense to me.
Oh, good.
I thought you were saying, did you lose yourself in a technical sense? Like, could I still see you? I can still see you. Is that reassuring?
It means I
still exist. You still exist. So, but on this, I mean, you cite a number of things that should make us kind of skeptical of our own judgment. I mean, you get into, is it Drew Weston, the political scientist who studied?
I love that study. One of these days, I'm going to find out that there's something wrong with that study, and it is going to throw a big wrench into my reality. I'm going to have to incorporate it. I'm prepared because studies are always found to be flawed, but I love that study so much.
This is the brain scan study?
Yes.
So tell us about that.
Okay, so let's say you're a Republican, all right? Well, he divided a group between Republicans and Democrats, and then he presented each of them with a lie, an obvious lie, a pandering, foul lie, right? And the lie was presented either by the member of an opposite party, not your party, or a neutral person, kind of like a Tom Hanks, and then your own partisan, somebody of your own party, and they hooked you up to an fMRI, which watches your brain activity in real time and records it. And what they found is that when you were lied to by somebody from the opposite party or a neutral character, your reasoning sections lit up. You cogitated, and you went, meh, that guy's a liar. And but when confronted with your lying partisan, what happened is there was a part of the brain called your anterior cingulate, which lit up, which apparently governs threat and emotions. Mm-hmm. The way that Drew Weston described it, it was like Lost in Space, danger, Will Robinson, and people got all upset. Their brains got all upset. The reasoning area stayed dark. And then at some point, when you were able to figure out how to reconcile this statement, which probably involves lying to yourself to some degree or other, or explaining it and all of that, your anterior cingulate calmed down and you got a shot of dopamine, which is basically cocaine, reward neurotransmitter. Mm-hmm. So basically we are wired to lie to ourselves. We are wired to push away information that threatens our worldview. Our chemistry demands it. And so we are not going to transcend this easily. And of course, most people think they don't lie to themselves. And all I can say is, yeah, you do. But people don't know it. I spent all this time staring at it, and I have this weird inkling, but it doesn't really dent my conviction that I'm right.
Right. So you just used the word transcend, which reminds me of a passage in your book near the end. There are countless actions to take, but all such efforts are hobbled inexorably by rage, bafflement, and despair. So to defend against all that emotional interference, I'm making a case for taking a stab at a little transcendence, not to compromise principles of justice and equality, but to expand the world that, for so long, has, in Lippmann's words, fit us as snugly as an old shoe. So what does that mean exactly there? What kind of thing are you advocating?
Right. It seems like it's some sort of kumbaya moment that
which is okay with me. I'm increasingly in favor of these, but
no, you're such an ethical guy, and I admire that so much about you, and I really do. You gave me a happy ending for my book, or at least you said that we only had a 50% chance of destroying ourselves.
I'm afraid that estimation has changed since I wrote that book, but I don't want to be any more of a downer than I have to be. So go ahead.
Anyway, so my feeling was, and that line that you sort of went, I don't mean that you have to sacrifice your blah, 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 but when you say listen to people think that you mean listen to them with an open mind towards changing your own point of view. Now, that's fine if that happens. I think that's great. If you are able to change your own point of view, if you're actually capable of that, then that means both you are a fine human being and also that person who is convincing you has made a super airtight case, because we aren't going to do it casually, as William James described. So that's great if that happens, but that's not really what I'm expecting will happen, and there's no point in advocating for what is nearly impossible. So what I'm actually advocating for is to protect yourself, to build your reality along more durable lines, actually know something about the things you hold such strong opinions about, which you hold the preposition in the middle of the sentence.
You had at least as many. The main thing is have at least as many prepositions as you need. And I heard one, so we're good.
Anyway, the thing is that you have really strong opinions. Chances are that, except for a few of them where you've really taken an interest, They're borrowed opinions. They're opinions you've taken from your cohort. And you don't really know what the fuck you really are talking about. So what I'm suggesting is go out there, find out what is out there. What did we miss? Because getting back to the beginning of the book, we missed something, and it's happened before, and the impact is anguishing. I mean, one thing that Lippmann was talking about was the period after World War I, a period he wrote about quite a lot. This was a period for an entire lost generation, an entire generation whose beliefs and values and principles were shredded. And what happened for a very long time, some great art was created, all based around the idea of meaninglessness. But, it's not really a world you want to pass on, It is a world that you make when you are floating in the void and you try and make art out of that. It was a time of enormous pain. And it was a time in which many of the values that are good, that lead to good outcomes and good policies, were washed away along with the bad. A tremendous amount of damage is done when your world explodes, unless you take advantage of the opportunity.
So these people we should listen to, I take it these are, in this case, Trump supporters.
Okay. Yeah, but here's what I'm saying. We've had, there's been a lot of mea culpas, especially in the media, about how, we missed this, we missed this. I want to state a couple of things. First of all, the Trump supporter, the vast majority, I mean, really like way, way up there, were Mitt Romney supporters and Mitt Romney types. The Trump supporter had a higher salary overall than a Clinton supporter. I know that there are there's discussion of lower education levels. That may very well be true. But the thing is that a lot of Trump supporters are people and
I'm related to several of them.
And I don't think they realize that their selfishness is going to cast our nation on the rocks of.
But wait, can I stop you there? I mean, who among us is not selfish? I mean, if you're looking, isn't this just a fact of politics that most voters are going to vote their self-interest?
No.
It's not?
It's a myth. That is a myth. And in fact, who addresses this myth really well? Walter Lippmann. Yeah, people do not vote their own interests frequently. They vote to keep their reality consistent. Now, that narrow slice of people that we think of as the Trump voter, the Trump voter who, is an angry white man who's, got opioid problems in the family and who feels that their birthright has been stolen from them by immigrants and they're not going to be able to pass on a good life to their children, and the factory job closed down and blah, 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 the whole 9 yards. Well, I mean, those people exist, and they made a difference. And they made a difference because of the Electoral College, and we don't have to go there. There are problems with our democracy. But they have a gripe, and it's a legitimate one. They've been fucked over too. They just don't see that. They don't see that it isn't the immigrants that did that to them. There is some evidence that immigrants may hold down certain salaries, but the vast majority of them are taking jobs, as we all know, that nobody wants.
Okay. But I mean, then the critique is not that they're selfish, it's that their selfishness is not well informed. There you're not complaining that they're pursuing their self-interest. You're saying at least have a well-informed self-interest. Understand what is and is not responsible for you having lost your job. Right.
There's that too, but there's also their identity. I mean, there's a lot to do about the America that they knew, the America that they believe is leaving them, or that they're being thrust away from. You know, we hear a lot of the word privilege. Sometimes that kind of privilege is clung to very fiercely because there isn't much else. So there is that. But the problem is that when the media went out there during the election, and they did, and they've been there since, presumably to make up for the fact that they missed something big, I think it's because they asked the wrong question. It was, why are you voting for Trump? Instead of, how do you live? And they're still not asking, how do you live? And what do you, and they just, they didn't see them as human beings. And that's the problem, is that they are.
Okay, so you're
as some sort of strange exotic species because we live on the coasts.
Yeah, it's a hard thing because on the one hand, a premise that is implicit in a lot of what those of us who don't like Trump say is that there's something strange that just happened. Yes. And by implication, there's something strange about the way these people voted, and they must have a very different worldview from ours. I mean, they must have a very different worldview from mine. So if you're going to go investigate people who have a very different worldview from yours, you do tend toward a kind of an anthropological tone, like visiting this exotic place. And in a way, that's bad. And in a way, who's to deny they must be very different from me, right? I mean, it's a tough. I'm just saying it's a tough thing. It's like there's this guy Chris Arnaud, is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he's kind of out there, and his thing is like to kind of act like he's one of them. He eats at McDonald's. So do I, by the way. But anyway, I mean, he's like, and that's one approach. But I just wonder. I don't know. It's a hard it's a hard thing.
It is. And the thing is that I'm not even saying, I mean, first of all, who's going to take their money and their vacation time and head off to Western Kentucky or something like that? I mean, it's but there are things you can do. I mean even just edge out. I mean, I know somebody who said, yeah, I know people said that I'm supposed to go and read different points of view, and I read InfoWars, and that guy is crazy. And I went, you couldn't have picked a more validating place to go for your dose of otherness. I mean, you don't go to the loons. That is exactly what they do on the right. They'll go for the loons. Right, they'll go for the lefties that say all of these things that are not represented in the mainstream, and that validates your position that you extrapolate that weirdo onto millions of people, and that's the end of it. I mean, that's the essence of prejudice, right? And so so what I suggest is that for liberals who are worried about their reality and trying to figure out things, why don't you start closer to home? Maybe like edge out into commentary and National Review territory, maybe a little Weekly Standard. Although those guys don't like Trump.
Not all the way to Breitbart?
Those guys don't like Trump. Well, the trouble is that those are lies. They are lies.
Well, okay, but the premise of your book is that one problem we face is lies or untrue things being believed by a lot of people. So certainly you have to examine the untrue things, right?
You can do that in half an hour on Fox News. I mean,
well, maybe that's the place you should go.
But the thing is that those beliefs can change. Obama's not a Muslim. Obama's a Muslim. Obama's a Muslim. Obama's not a Muslim. Okay, boom, over. It's not about the beliefs. It really isn't. Those are stupid rhetorical talking points.
But it's about the circumstances that have led people to be amenable to these beliefs. I mean, I think it's I think you get into this fact that people who have lost an election are more open to conspiracy theories than, and it can work either way. It can be on the left or on the right. You're more open to conspiracy. Circumstances make you more or less amenable to untruth.
Right. Yes, without question. And that is true on the right and on the left. Not equally true, according to studies, but true.
And do you see any of that in the anti-Trump sector? Relatedly, I wanted to ask you, how good a job do you think the kind of anti-Trump media is doing? And I think it's safe to say, frankly, that most of what's called mainstream media is anti-Trump, much of it. I mean, New York Times is, the Washington Post is.
Excellent studies that show that Trump's coverage is unprecedentedly negative, but a lot of that has to do with just reporting what he says.
Okay, but here's a good example of something that may go beyond that. Now, did you see this piece in the Times recently, the compilation of Trump's lies?
Mm-hmm.
And the New York Times has also used lies in headlines. I think that was in the opinion section, but in the straight news coverage, they've used lies in the headline to describe what Trump has done. Now, that's, I think, a departure from traditional journalistic practice. I think traditional straight news reporting, first of all, took account of the fact that the word lies has a very specific meaning. It means you consciously mean to deceive. And, when people say things that aren't true, it's usually pretty hard to be sure that they did that on purpose, as opposed to deluding themselves first or misspeaking or whatever. I think that's kind of new, and I don't think everyone's doing it. I don't think the Washington Post is following that rule. But
I don't believe National Public Radio is either.
Right. So, what about? I mean, isn't that kind of a departure? And B, doesn't it kind of play into Trump's hands in the sense that it makes it easier for him to say to his base, "See, New York Times hates me. You can't trust anything they say."
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, those are two really separate questions. Because I know you closely read The Influencing Machine.
Closely.
I'll be telling you something that you no doubt already know, which is this notion of a civil discussion. A discussion that is not ad hominem and does not attack each other and is not plain spoken in Anglo-Saxon speech, but more mediated through a kind of a diplomatic filter, is more or less an invention of mid-century, because television, for the first time, media became more expensive because of technology rather than less. They needed a much bigger audience, which speaks to your second point. What's happening? Are they just turning off the people, the Times and so on, that they ought to be trying to reach, and giving Trump ammunition? Not that he needs it, because he'll just make it up. But that said, basically, what happened in mid-century is you had television, which is an incredibly expensive medium, and it was on a limited platform, the broadcast waves, which were licensed by the government.
Right.
So they had to make deals with the government. That's the technology and the regulatory environment. Then the final piece of that was an existential threat. There was a threat to the nation. This was the heaviest time of nuclear annihilation fear. So what happened is that you got the people who spoke to you from above with uninflected voices, who never said a sharply defined word, and when they did, it was huge news. As we know, we can identify the 3 or 4 times Walter Cronkite did it, and it was a closed circle. These were gatekeepers that really decided what was properly in the realm of public debate and what was not. Mm-hmm. This was a time with a huge public square. So just think of it. Civility, that sounds great. Public square, share information, that sounds great. All extreme voices marginalized. Well, nowadays that sounds kind of good. And ones that even weren't that extreme. and no black people, and no people with accents, and no people with vowels at the end of their name, no poor people, hardly any Jews except for comic relief or behind the camera. This was a Leave It to Beaver world that was meant to be resolutely inoffensive, so in order to hold on to the same audience, and everyone in America, no matter who they were, had to buy onto that. That was the only image of the country they had. So we have gained a lot with all of this fragmentation. But really what it does is because media suddenly got so much cheaper again, it brought us back to the period before television to a large extent. And if you look at those newspapers and at that public discussion, you are going to see some blood coming out of everybody's whatever.
Yeah, but it still could be the case that the tone that Walter Cronkite had convinced people that he was impartial. And I'm just asking whether if the mainstream media wants to win the trust of as many kind of people in the margins of Trump support as possible, those who could go either way, might it make sense to adopt as neutral sounding a tone as possible?
As long as, I agree, as long as it doesn't compromise the primary mission of journalism, which is to tell it like it really is to the extent that it can be known. And does that mean you have to use the word lie? No, I don't really think so. We've had that debate here. Bob and I, my co-host,
Bob Garfield.
Yeah, we tussle about this all the time. We are in almost complete disagreement because, the day we did a podcast the day after of the editorial meeting, and it was basically just Bob and me arguing over how to proceed. I said, we need to find out what's going on out there. And he basically said, we need to get on the barricades with our flags and our pitchforks and lead the revolution. I said, there are other people who can do that. That's not our job. And so I agree with you. I think people are very relieved. A lot of people don't understand that reporters are human beings, and that I think that there's just this tremendous sense of relief that people can say what they really believe plainly. And I think that people are deeply offended. And also, offended by what he has done to our discourse. And then, of course, reporters themselves are probably pissed off at how he disparages the very institution of the media. Nobody says it's great, but it's what we got. And, it is one of the major engines of accountability. And we have seen one of the things that Trump does in order to play with reality is to diminish or disable all of those engines of accountability. And that means taking money out of the census and not letting the EPA publish its research and disparaging the CBO when he doesn't like the numbers that they come up with.
And not letting them turn on the cameras during the daily press briefing.
Well, frankly, no great loss. I think it's kind of disappointing. I'm not really disappointed because I never expected much, but the management of the White House press corps is still playing by 1950s rules. And I think that they could have gotten together. They could have said, well, none of us will show up, or somebody could have secretly turned on their phone and then later shared it with everybody. There were a million things that they could do if they wanted to, but frankly, this daily briefing is a Clinton innovation, and it is moribund. It was the moment it began. If you're going to have a live press conference, do it when there's actually something to talk about. Otherwise, it's just an opportunity for everybody to grab.
But I got to say, Trump provides things that seem worth talking about, or at least inspire people to talk about them with a frequency we're not accustomed to. Let me close by asking you kind of your theory.
Close? You mean we're over?
What? No, we don't have to. You're the one who has to get on with real work, Brooke. I'm like, semi-retired. I want to hear your kind of theory of Trump, because among the kind of great thinkers you refer to in the book is Hannah Arendt, I guess it is.
It's Arendt. I have a German friend correct me, as well as many people.
Arendt?
Arendt.
Oh, like the word aren't. Aren't you?
Yeah.
Aren't you a nice person? Okay, so and you actually don't get so much into the banality of evil, which is one thing she's famous for, in writing about, Eichmann and so on.
And criticized for, too, actually.
What's that?
She's criticized for that. Turns out...
She is, but
she bought his story.
It kind of applies to Trump in the sense that one question with Trump is like, to what extent is this just an extreme example of a politician and a human being? So in other words, narcissism is just kind of something we all have turned up to 11. The tendency to be as dishonest as people like you and me believe he is kind of a normal human tendency turned up to 11. And moreover, there have always been politicians who would seemingly say whatever they could get away with. It may just be that Trump's in a circumstance where he can get away with more than people mostly can. Anyway, one theory of Trump is like, he's not that bizarre. And yet, I gotta say, we are taping this. This won't run for a few days. We are taping this on the day that Trump did this now infamous plastic surgery tweet about Morning Joe. And he does something on that, and I just have to, I'm a little partial to the banality of evil theory. Like, this is like basically ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and one person, Trump, is a little worse than average. But then he does something like that, and I just am at a loss for a theory.
He's not the ordinary person in an extraordinary circumstance. He is the extraordinary circumstance. And the thing is that he is a driver of all of this. Now, I don't know if he has a plan, or even if he wants one, or if we're just watching a naked id marching continually across the public stage. And I think that's probably the latter. His convictions flutter this way and that with whoever flatters him or whoever was in his office last. He's got loyalty to his family and nobody else. He ripped people off continuously as a businessman, and there was no reason to assume that he wouldn't do it now. Laws were meant to be broken or stretched. Norms were his enemy. Well, they were his friend because he could break them and then be credited with genuine authenticity. This is a kind of a mixture of the commercial. It's like if you take the absolute apotheosis of commercial sales and you stick it into the presidency, this is kind of what you end up with no end except to buy. And to buy what? Just to buy, just to respond favorably to Trump in a poll? Nobody really knows what he wants. This, what Hannah Arendt did that I thought was so interesting is describe the techniques that were used in the rise of Hitler. But Hitler and his advisors were smart. They were also Nazis. I don't think Trump and his advisors are either of those things, nor do I think his followers are Nazis. But we do see someone who is brilliant at wresting control of the narrative by filling the air with shiny objects and seems to have no end game.
Yeah, that's the puzzling.
So look at his techniques. That's what I do. I anatomize them so that you can recognize them, so at least you won't find that there are neural pathways being carved in your own brain because of his Homeric, epithet. epithets like, fleet-footed Hermes and crooked Hillary.
Yeah. And when you say he is the extraordinary circumstance, I think I can infer from what you've said earlier that you don't mean by that we shouldn't look at the circumstances, like in Middle America, the economic circumstances and so on, that allowed a circumstance like him to arise. He didn't arise in a vacuum.
He did not arise in a vacuum, no. He was a perfect man for his time in the sense that people had been disgusted for years with deadlock, and many people were continually horrified by the presidency of Barack Obama. So, there is certainly a great degree of racism that plays a role in some of his constituents. I think I'm breaking up because I'm at 5% battery. Maybe I should go.
Maybe that's it. It's a cool kind of trippy effect. It's I like the visual effect. We're going to preserve that. It's people who are listening on podcast should come look at the actual video. So in closing, I want to say everybody should read The Trouble with Reality: A Rumination on Moral Panic in Our Time. A read that even today, when we're all pressed for time, you can accomplish this feat of reading this book. They should also listen to On the Media, and of course, even if it isn't on their local public radio station, which it may be, and certainly is if they're in New York or New Jersey.
Actually, we're on 450 stations.
Well, then it probably is, but what I was going to say was there's always podcasts.
Yes, there is, and we put more stuff in the podcast feed. Such a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad we got to do this.
Same here, Brooke. Keep up the good fight.
You too.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.